She went to visit her mom, but when she saw the millionaire's Mercedes parked 3 houses down, something twisted in her gut. What she overheard through the kitchen window destroyed everything she thought she knew about her family. Truths a daughter should never learn about her mother. The dead speak loudest in November, and Kirsty Street Peter heard her father's voice in the cold wind that swept through Philadelphia's Germantown streets. 5 years after a heart attack stole him away, Kirsty stood at the corner of Tulpehocken Street, her hands wrapped around the casserole dish that had grown cold during the drive, watching the streetlights flicker on against the early dusk. She had been 27 when her father died, old enough to grieve like an adult, young enough to still feel orphaned. Now at 32, Kirsty carried her father's gentle strength in her steady gaze and rich dark skin that seemed to hold warmth even in winter's bite. "That's not Mr. Henderson's car," Kirsty murmured to herself, though the observation landed with weight. The sleek black Mercedes sat parked exactly 2 houses down from her mother's modest brick row home, its polished surface gleaming like oil on water. In this working-class neighborhood where most people drove 10-year-old Toyotas and took the bus, a car like that announced itself like a siren. Vern Coleman's car. She'd seen it before once at her father's funeral. The real estate developer who'd sent an enormous arrangement of white roses and stayed precisely 7 minutes at the repast. Long enough to clasp her mother's hand with both of his, murmuring condolences that felt rehearsed. Perhaps he's helping with paperwork, Kirsty thought, though the words felt hollow even unspoken. Her mother had mentioned nothing about expecting visitors today. In 5 years of strained Sunday dinners and obligatory holiday calls, her mother mentioned very little that mattered. Kirsty's fingers tightened on the casserole dish, the ceramic still faintly warm. She had come to visit out of duty, the same grinding duty that had shaped her life since the funeral, since her mother had transformed overnight from grieving widow to someone Kirsty barely recognized. Someone who smiled too quickly, who wore new clothes and expensive perfume, who suggested with increasing urgency that Kirsty move on and stop living in the past. "Just drop off the food and leave," Kirsty whispered to herself, but her feet carried her forward anyway, past the Mercedes with its vanity plates, VC Prop 1, past Mrs. Chen's house with its riot of chrysanthemums, toward her childhood home where the porch light burned yellow against the November dark. That's when she heard it. The kitchen window, cracked open despite the cold. Her mother's lifelong habit, believing fresh air cured everything from headaches to heartbreak. Voices drifted through that narrow gap, carried on the wind that smelled of dead leaves and coming rain. 5 years, Vern. 5 years of playing the grieving widow. Her mother's voice, but transformed. Not the flat, exhausted tone Kirsty had grown accustomed to, but something alive, vibrant, almost girlish. Kirsty froze on the sidewalk, the casserole dish heavy in her hands. "You played it perfectly, darling." A man's voice, smooth as expensive scotch. "Vern Coleman. Even I almost believed you missed him." Their laughter mingled like smoke, and Kirsty felt the world tilt sideways. Her feet moved without conscious thought, carrying her off the sidewalk, around the side of the house where the azalea bushes provided cover, where she could see through the kitchen window into the warm light beyond. Her mother stood at the counter, pouring wine into crystal glasses Kirsty had never seen before. She wore a cream silk blouse that probably cost more than Kirsty's monthly rent, and her hair, always worn in a simple bun when Kirsty visited, fell in glossy waves around her shoulders. Vern Coleman stood close, too close, his hand resting possessively on the small of her mother's back. "I still dream about that night sometimes," her mother said, her voice dropping to something almost reverent. She handed Vern his glass, and their fingers lingered together. "When I gave him the final dose, when Gerald finally stopped breathing, I felt free for the first time in 20 years. The casserole dish slipped from Kirsty's hands. It hit the ground with a crack that seemed deafening in the quiet evening, ceramic splitting, green bean casserole spilling across the concrete. But Kirsty couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand frozen while her mother's words echoed through her skull like bullets. When Gerald finally stopped breathing, I felt free. What was that? Vern's voice, sharp now, alert. Through the window, Kirsty watched her mother move to the sink, peering out into the darkness. For one terrible moment, they made eye contact, daughter and mother, truth suspended between them like a blade. Then Kirsty ran. She ran like she hadn't run since childhood, her sensible flats slapping against sidewalk, her breath tearing through her lungs in ragged gasps. Behind her, she heard the front door open, heard her mother's voice calling Kirsty. "Kirsty, is that you?" But Kirsty didn't stop, couldn't stop. Not until she reached her car parked 2 blocks away. Not until she was inside with the doors locked and her hands shaking so violently she couldn't fit the key in the ignition. When Gerald finally stopped breathing, I felt free. Her father, her gentle, careful father who'd taught her to ride a bike and balance a checkbook, who'd worked 60-hour weeks as an accountant to send her to college, who'd kissed her forehead and told her he loved her the morning before he died at his desk, supposedly of a massive heart attack. 58 years old, with no family history, no warning signs. Kirsty's phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "Honey, was that you? Please come inside. We need to talk." Another buzz. "Kirsty, don't be dramatic. Come back." Another, "You're imagining things. You always imagine things." Kirsty stared at the messages, at the gaslighting condensed into 3 text bubbles, and something crystallized in her chest. Not grief, not shock, something harder, colder, rage. With shaking fingers, she opened her voice recorder app and scrolled back. She'd accidentally left it running when she'd recorded a work memo earlier. And there, beneath her own breathing, beneath the sound of ceramic shattering, she could hear them, faint but audible, her mother's confession drifting through the November night. When Gerald finally stopped breathing, I felt free. Kirsty saved the file, backed it up to 3 different cloud services, and finally managed to start her car. As she pulled away from the curb, she looked in her rearview mirror and saw her mother standing on the porch, backlit by the warm glow of the house where Kirsty had grown up, where her father had died. "I'm not imagining things, Mom," Kirsty whispered to her reflection, to the ghost of her father, to the daughter she'd been 5 years ago who'd accepted the official story because questioning it hurt too much. Not anymore. The drive home took 23 minutes. Kirsty knew because she counted every red light, every turn, every breath that didn't quite fill her lungs. The counting kept her grounded, kept her from screaming, kept her moving forward when every instinct said to pull over and shatter like that casserole dish. Inside her apartment, a modest 1-bedroom in Fishtown that her father had co-signed for, Kirsty moved with sudden purpose. She pulled out the cardboard box from the back of her closet, the one she hadn't opened since the funeral. Her father's personal effects, his datebook, his reading glasses. His work files that she'd rescued from his office before her mother could clean everything out. For 5 years, she'd told herself she kept them for sentimental reasons. Now she wondered if some part of her had always known, had always suspected. Kirsty spread the files across her coffee table, and for the first time since her father's death, she really looked at them. Not with a grieving daughter's eyes, but with an investigator's. And there, in the margins of seemingly routine accounting ledgers, she found them. Notes, questions, calculations that didn't quite add up. Vernon Coleman Properties. Discrepancy in reported income versus expenditures. Query. Shell companies? Money laundering? VC development project. Market Street. Permits approved despite violations. Check political contributions. Meeting with VC November 15th. He seemed nervous when I asked about the offshore accounts. The entries stopped 2 weeks before her father's death. Kirsty sat back on her heels, staring at her father's careful handwriting, and understood. He'd found something big enough that Vern Coleman needed him silenced. Something valuable enough that her mother had been willing to become a murderer. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from her mother. We need to talk about what you think you heard. You're confused, baby. You've been stressed. Maybe we should make you an appointment with Dr. Rivera? The suggestion landed like a threat. Dr. Rivera, who her mother had been pushing her toward for months, suggesting Kirsty needed someone to talk to about her lingering grief and difficulty moving on. They were already building a narrative. Unstable daughter, unreliable narrator, grief-induced delusions. Kirsty's hands tightened on her phone, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 5 years. Not since the day they'd lowered her father's casket into the ground and she'd believed she was alone in the world. Determination. You taught me to follow the money, Dad, Kirsty whispered to the empty apartment, to the files spread across her table, to the ghost of the man who'd raised her to ask questions and demand answers. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Outside, November's wind rattled the windows like a warning, and Kirsty thought she heard her father's voice in its howl. Not the gentle voice of her childhood, but something fiercer, stronger. Fight, baby girl. It's time to fight. Chapter 1. The Daughter Who Knew Too Much. Kirsty didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat at her coffee table, surrounded by her father's files, a legal pad, and enough coffee to fuel a small army. She worked with the methodical precision her father had taught her, organizing documents chronologically, highlighting connections, building a timeline. 3:47 a.m. Discovery of first discrepancy in Coleman Properties. 11:12 a.m. Father's note about uncomfortable meeting with VC. November 28th. Father's final journal entry. Meeting VC tomorrow. Taking backup files home. Something wrong. November 29th. Gerald St. Peter pronounced dead at 2:15 p.m. The pattern emerged like a photograph in developing fluid. Clear. Damning. Impossible to unsee. But Kirsty needed more than her father's notes. She needed proof. She needed someone who understood forensic accounting, who could trace money through the labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. She needed someone who wouldn't dismiss her as a grief-stricken daughter seeing conspiracies in coincidence. As dawn broke gray and cold over Philadelphia, Kirsty remembered. There had been another accountant at her father's firm. Young, brilliant, always asking questions that made partners uncomfortable. Someone her father had mentioned with approval. What was his name? She dug through her father's Rolodex. He'd never fully trusted digital contacts, and found it. Marcus Webb. But the number listed wasn't for an accounting firm. It was for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Kirsty pulled up the newspaper's website and searched his name. Article after article appeared, all investigative journalism, corporate fraud, political corruption, real estate schemes. And there, from 2 years ago, pattern of suspicious deaths surrounds local developers' projects. The byline photo showed a man in his mid-30s with sharp eyes and a skeptical half-smile. The article's opening line made Kirsty's breath catch. When 3 men die of natural causes within 2 years, and all 3 were investigating Vernon Coleman's business practices, it stops being coincidence and starts being murder. Her phone buzzed. Another text from her mother. Kirsty, please, let's have breakfast. Let me explain. Kirsty stared at the message, at the manipulation disguised as maternal concern, and made her decision. She forwarded the text to a new folder labeled Evidence, then opened her email and began to type. Asterisk Mr. Webb. You don't know me, but you knew my father, Gerald St. Peter. He died 5 years ago of a heart attack while investigating Vernon Coleman. Last night I learned it was murder. I have evidence. I have his files. And I have a recording of my mother confessing to his murder. I know how this sounds. I know what you're thinking. Grief-stricken daughter, conspiracy theories, unreliable narrator. But my father taught me to follow the evidence. And the evidence says Vernon Coleman has been killing people for decades. I need help. If you're still interested in the truth, meet me. Kirsty St. Peter asterisk. She attached a portion of her father's notes and the audio file from last night, then sat staring at the send button for a full minute. This was it. The moment of no return. Once she sent this, she became her mother's enemy. Once she sent this, she put herself in the same danger that had killed her father. Kirsty thought of her mother's voice. When Gerald finally stopped breathing, I felt free. She hit send. The response came 3 hours later, while Kirsty was standing in the shower, letting scalding water beat against her skin, trying to feel something other than numb. Coffee. Today. Noon. The last drop on Pine Street. Come alone. Bring everything. M.W. Kirsty dried off, dressed in jeans and the Temple University hoodie her father had bought her for graduation, and spent the remaining hours organizing copies of every document, every note, every piece of evidence she had. She uploaded everything to a secure cloud drive, emailed copies to herself, and left a physical set in a safety deposit box at her bank with instructions to be opened if anything happened to her. Her mother called twice. Kirsty didn't answer. The voicemails were masterclasses in manipulation. Baby, I'm so worried about you. You seemed so confused last night. Please call me so we can talk about what you think you heard. Kirsty, you're scaring me. I spoke with Vern and we think maybe you've been working too hard. Stress can make us hear things that aren't there, you know? Please, let's get you some help. Kirsty saved both messages, backed them up, and deleted nothing. At 11:45, she grabbed her father's leather messenger bag, now stuffed with evidence, and headed for the coffee shop. The November morning was bitter cold, the sky threatening snow that wouldn't quite fall. Kirsty walked quickly, checking over her shoulder every few blocks, paranoid but not unreasonably so. If her mother knew what she'd overheard, if Vern Coleman knew she had evidence, The last drop was warm and crowded with students from the nearby university. Kirsty ordered black coffee and found a table in the back corner, positioning herself so she could see both the door and the windows. Her father had taught her that too, though he'd framed it as good business sense rather than survival instinct. At exactly noon, a man in a worn peacoat pushed through the door, scanning the room with practiced efficiency. Marcus Webb looked older than his byline photo, with lines around his eyes that spoke of too many late nights and not enough answers. His gaze found Kirsty, held for a moment of assessment. Then he nodded and headed for the counter. He returned with coffee and a notebook, sliding into the seat across from her without preamble. "You look like your father," he said. Not a question, just an observation. "Did you know him well?" "Well enough to know he was brilliant, honest, and the kind of accountant who made criminals nervous." Marcus pulled out a pen. "Well enough to know that when he died, it didn't sit right. Heart attack at 58. No history. Perfect health 6 months earlier." He shook his head. "I wanted to investigate, but I couldn't get anyone to talk. Everyone was scared." "Of Vernon Coleman." "Of Vernon Coleman," Marcus confirmed. "I've been tracking him for 3 years, Kirsty. Can I call you Kirsty?" At her nod, he continued. 3 years of following money trails that vanish into offshore accounts, interviewing widows who got rich after their husbands died, documenting a pattern of deaths that the police call coincidence and I call murder. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I listened to the recording you sent. Your mother's voice, I presume." Kirsty nodded, not trusting her voice. "That's confession to first-degree murder. With corroborating evidence from your father's files, we might have enough to reopen the case." He paused. "But Kirsty, you understand what this means? You're accusing your own mother of killing your father. You're going after one of the most powerful men in Philadelphia. They will come for you. They will try to discredit you, destroy you, maybe worse." "I know," Kirsty said, and was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I spent 5 years being a good daughter, accepting the official story, believing my mother when she said my father just gave up, had a weak heart, bad luck." She met Marcus's gaze. "I'm done being good. I'm done accepting lies. My father deserves the truth." Marcus studied her for a long moment, then smiled, the same skeptical half-smile from his byline photo, but warmer now. "Proving. Then let's get him justice," he said and opened his notebook. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything. I understand now you want me to write out each chapter directly in my response, not create downloadable files. Let me continue with the next chapters." Chapter 2. The Journalist. The last drop smelled like espresso and old books, the kind of coffee shop that attracted artists and students and people who needed to disappear into corner booths for hours. Kirsty arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a table in the back where she could watch the door. She'd sent Marcus Webb an email at dawn, attaching portions of her father's notes and a carefully edited clip of the audio recording. His response had come within an hour. Noon. Last drop on Pine. Come alone. Now she sat nursing black coffee that had gone cold, her father's messenger bag heavy on the floor beside her, and tried not to think about how insane this all was. Contacting a journalist she'd never met, accusing her own mother of murder, building a case on overheard conversations and 5-year-old accounting ledgers. But every time doubt crept in, she heard her mother's voice. When Gerald finally stopped breathing, I felt free. At 12:03, a man in a worn peacoat pushed through the door, bringing November cold with him. Marcus Webb looked exactly like his byline photo, sharp-eyed and skeptical, with the kind of tired that came from chasing stories no one else wanted to touch. He scanned the coffee shop with practiced efficiency, his gaze landing on Kirsty and holding for a beat of assessment before he nodded and headed for the counter. He returned with coffee and a weathered notebook, sliding into the seat across from her without ceremony. "You look like your father," he said, and something in Kirsty's chest cracked open at the simple observation. Gerald was a good man, honest, the kind of accountant who actually read the footnotes and asked uncomfortable questions. "You knew him?" Kirsty's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "I interviewed him 2 years before he died, for a piece on municipal contracting fraud. He wouldn't go on record, but he pointed me in the right direction. Told me to follow the permits, the zoning changes, the money that moved right before city council votes." Marcus took a long drink of his coffee. 3 months after my article ran, 2 of my sources had their contracts terminated. 6 months after that, your father was dead. You think they're connected? I think Vernon Coleman doesn't like people who ask questions about his business dealings. Marcus opened his notebook to a page dense with handwriting. "I've been tracking him for 4 years, Kirsty. For years of following money that vanishes into shell companies, interviewing people too scared to talk, documenting deaths that look natural until you see the pattern." He met her eyes. "When your father died, I tried to investigate, requested the autopsy report, interviewed the EMTs, talked to his colleagues. Everyone said the same thing: heart attack, no signs of foul play, tragic but natural. But Gerald St. Peter had perfect health 6 months before. No family history, no warning signs. My mother poisoned him." Kirsty said it out loud for the first time, and the words landed like stones. "I heard her confess. She and Vern Coleman, they killed him together." Marcus's expression didn't change, but his pen moved to paper. "Tell me everything." So Kirsty did. She told him about the Mercedes parked 3 houses down, about the voices through the kitchen window, about her mother's confession delivered like a love story. She showed him her father's appointment book, the notes that stopped 2 weeks before his death, the questions about Coleman's business dealings that had never been answered. Marcus listened without interrupting, his pen moving steadily across the page, occasionally pausing to ask for clarification or request to photograph a document. When she finished, he sat back and studied her with those sharp journalist's eyes. "You understand what you're asking me to help you do? You're going after your own mother. You're accusing one of the most powerful men in Philadelphia of murder. Vernon Coleman has connections in City Hall, the police department, the courts. He's untouchable, Kirsty. I've been trying to bring him down for 4 years, and he's still walking free. Then maybe you need someone who has nothing left to lose," Kirsty said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "He killed my father. My mother helped him do it. And I'm done being the good daughter who accepts comfortable lies." Marcus studied her for a long moment, then smiled. Not the skeptical half-smile from his byline photo, but something genuine and fierce. "Your father would be proud of you," he said quietly. Then he flipped to a fresh page in his notebook. "All right, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. We need more than a recording and some old files. We need medical records, prescription histories, financial transactions, a complete timeline. We need to build a case so airtight that even Coleman's lawyers can't tear it apart. Where do we start? We start, Marcus said, by finding out exactly how your father died, and then we prove it was murder. Chapter 3. The Ghost of Gerald St. Peter. Kirsty's apartment became a war room. Marcus arrived the next morning with 2 banker's boxes full of research, newspaper clippings, property records, death certificates, all circling Vernon Coleman like evidence of a cancer that kept metastasizing. They spread everything across her living room floor, her father's files mixing with Marcus's investigation until the pattern became impossible to ignore. 3 men, Marcus said, arranging photographs in a row. All accountants or financial consultants. All discovered irregularities in Coleman's business dealings. All dead within 18 months of raising concerns. He tapped the first photo. Robert Chun, 2018. Stroke at 52. His widow received a settlement from Coleman Properties 2 months later. Wrongful termination suit that was quietly resolved. He moved to the second photo. David Morrison, 2020. Fell down his basement stairs, head trauma. His life insurance paid out double because it was ruled accidental. The third photo was her father. Gerald St. Peter, 2021. Heart attack at 58. Kirsty stared at the 3 faces, at the pattern Marcus had spent years documenting that nobody else wanted to see. And the police never investigated the connection? Coleman donates heavily to the Fraternal Order of Police. Sits on charity boards with half the department brass. He's protected Kirsty. That's what makes him so dangerous. Marcus pulled out another file. But your father was smart. Smarter than Chun or Morrison. He knew he was in danger, and he left breadcrumbs. Together they went through her father's files with forensic precision. Gerald St. Peter had been methodical, documenting every discrepancy he found in Coleman's accounts. Shell companies registered in Delaware that existed only on paper. Property transfers that moved money offshore hours before zoning hearings. Campaign contributions that preceded favorable city council votes by exactly 1 week. Her father had been building a case, brick by careful brick. Here, Kirsty said, pulling out a manila folder she'd missed before. Inside were copies of prescription records from her mother's pharmacy. Why would my father have these? Marcus studied them, his expression darkening. Because he suspected. Look at the dates. All of these were filled in the 6 months before his death. Propranolol, digoxin, medications that affect heart rhythm. He looked up at Kirsty. In the right combinations, these could simulate a heart attack. Leave almost no trace in a standard autopsy. The room tilted. Kirsty had to sit down on the floor, her back against the couch, while Marcus continued analyzing the records. Her father had known, had documented his own murder as it was happening, leaving evidence for someone to find, for her to find. He was trying to protect me, Kirsty whispered. He knew they'd come after me next if I started asking questions. So he buried the evidence where only I would look. Marcus sat beside her, his shoulder warm against hers in the cold apartment. Then let's make sure he didn't die for nothing. Let's finish what he started. Chapter 4. The Medicine Cabinet. The Walgreens on Broad Street looked like every other pharmacy. Fluorescent lights, endless aisles of vitamins and greeting cards, a prescription counter at the back staffed by people who'd seen too much and said too little. Kirsty stood outside for 5 minutes, gathering courage, before Marcus's text came through. "You can do this. I'm right here." He was parked across the street in his beat-up Honda, watching through a telephoto lens in case her mother or Coleman had people watching. The paranoia felt justified now. Yesterday, Kirsty had noticed the same black sedan parked outside her apartment building twice. This morning, her mother had called 6 times, each voicemail more desperate than the last. Inside, the pharmacist was a tired-looking woman in her 50s named Gloria, according to her name tag. Kirsty approached the counter with her father's death certificate and a notarized letter claiming she was settling his estate and needed copies of all prescriptions filled in his name during the last year of his life. Gloria studied the documents, then studied Kirsty. "I remember your father," she said quietly. "Nice man. Always asked about my grandson." She typed something into her computer, frowned, then typed more. "That's odd." "What is?" "These prescriptions, they're in your father's name, but they weren't picked up by him. The signature on file is—" Gloria turned the screen so Kirsty could see. Her mother's signature again and again, picking up medications that should have raised red flags. Beta blockers for a man with normal blood pressure. Digoxin for someone with no heart condition. All of them prescribed by Dr. Raymond Kettering, a name Kirsty didn't recognize. "Can you print all of this?" Kirsty asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Gloria looked around the empty pharmacy, then hit print. "Your father was kind to me. If something wasn't right..." She handed Kirsty a thick stack of records. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Outside, Kirsty climbed into Marcus's car and spread the printouts across the dashboard. Together they traced the timeline. Prescriptions that started 8 months before her father's death, increasing in frequency and dosage. A methodical poisoning disguised as medical care. "Dr. Kettering," Marcus said, already pulling up his phone. "Let me guess, he's connected to Coleman somehow." 5 minutes of searching confirmed it. Raymond Kettering sat on the board of Coleman Properties Charitable Foundation. Had received a research grant from Coleman for $200,000 the year before Gerald died. "He was bought," Kirsty said flatly. "They bought a doctor to prescribe the medications that would kill my father." Marcus photographed every page, uploaded them to his secure server, then looked at Kirsty with something like awe. "We have them. This is conspiracy to commit murder. This is premeditated, calculated, cold-blooded." Kirsty's phone rang. Her mother. She let it go to voicemail, but the message that followed made her blood freeze. "Kirsty, I know what you're doing. I know you've been talking to that journalist. Please, baby, you don't understand what's at stake. Come home. Let's talk before you do something you can't take back." It wasn't a plea. It was a threat. Marcus heard it too, his expression hardening. "We need to move faster. If they know we're investigating, they'll start destroying evidence. Or worse. Worse. You're the only one left who knows the truth," Marcus said quietly. "And your father's not here to protect you anymore." Chapter 5: The Money Trail. Marcus's contact at the bank was a nervous woman named Sarah Chun, Robert Chen's daughter, one of the other men Coleman had killed. She met them in a coffee shop in Center City, her hands shaking as she passed Marcus a USB drive. "My father kept backup records of everything," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After he died, I found them in a safety deposit box. I was too scared to do anything with them, but if you're really going after Coleman..." She looked at Kirsty. Your father tried to warn mine. Called him 2 weeks before he died. Told him to be careful. My dad didn't listen. The USB drive contained 5 years of financial records showing money flowing from Coleman Properties into dozens of accounts, including one belonging to Kirsty's mother. The first deposit had been made 25 years ago, when her mother had first married her father. Small amounts at first, $5,000 here, $10,000 there. Then nothing for years. Then, 8 months before Gerald's death, the payments had resumed. Larger now, more frequent. The final payment, $250,000, had been deposited 1 week after the funeral. Kirsty stared at the screen, at the proof of her mother's betrayal converted into numbers and dates. She was paid to kill him. All those years, she was just waiting for the right time. Marcus traced the money further, finding a web of shell companies and offshore accounts. Coleman's been using this same pattern for decades. Find someone close to his target, a spouse, a business partner, someone with access. Offer them money to look the other way, or better yet, to help. Then when the target's gone, everybody wins. Except the dead man. They worked through the night, building a timeline that connected every payment to every prescription, every deposit to every doctor's visit. The evidence was damning, overwhelming, irrefutable. But as dawn broke over Philadelphia, Marcus's expression remained troubled. "What?" Kirsty asked. "We have evidence of murder. We have evidence of conspiracy. But we need a confession. We need them to say it on record in a way that can't be explained away by lawyers." He looked at her. "We need you to wear a wire." Chapter 6. The Other Widows. Before Kirsty could face her mother with a wire, Marcus wanted her to understand exactly who she was dealing with. That's how they ended up in a modest house in Chestnut Hill, sitting across from Elizabeth Morrison, whose husband David had fallen down his basement stairs 3 years ago. Elizabeth was elegant and brittle, like fine china that had been cracked and glued back together. She served tea in cups that trembled in her hands and told them the truth she'd never told the police. David found evidence that Coleman was laundering money through real estate developments. He was going to go to the FBI. Elizabeth's voice was steady, but tears ran down her face. The night before his meeting, he told me he'd hidden copies of everything. Then he went downstairs to get a bottle of wine, and I heard him fall. She set down her teacup. Except he didn't fall. I saw the bruises on his back later, at the funeral home. Bruises that looked like hands pushing. "Why didn't you tell the police?" Kirsty asked gently. "Because 2 days after the funeral, a lawyer came to my house. Said Coleman Properties wanted to settle David's wrongful termination suit, even though we'd never filed one. Offered me $300,000 to sign an NDA and move on with my life." Elizabeth met Kirsty's eyes. "He told me my daughter was starting at Penn in the fall. Said it would be a shame if anything happened to interrupt her education. So I took the money and kept quiet, and I've hated myself for 3 years." They found the same pattern with 2 other widows. Women who'd been paid to stay silent, threatened into compliance, left alone with their guilt and their blood money. By the time they left the last house, Kirsty understood. Her mother wasn't unique. She was just the only one who'd been willing to do the killing herself. "I'm ready," Kirsty told Marcus as they sat in his car outside her apartment. "Whatever it takes. I'm ready to wear the wire." Marcus pulled out a small device no bigger than a button. "Federal prosecutor signed off this morning. We'll be listening from a van outside. At the first sign of danger, we come in. But Kirsty, he looked at her seriously. Your mother is a murderer. Coleman is a killer. Don't underestimate them just because you're family. She stopped being my family the night she poisoned my father, Kirsty said, and meant it. Chapter 7, The Wire. The wire was smaller than Kirsty expected. No bigger than a shirt button, taped between her breasts where her mother wouldn't think to look even if she suspected. Federal Agent Diana Reyes had applied it with steady hands in the back of an unmarked van parked 2 blocks from her mother's house, while Marcus watched with the kind of intensity that made Kirsty feel both protected and terrified. You don't have to do this, Agent Reyes said for the 3rd time, her dark eyes searching Kirsty's face. We have enough evidence to bring charges. The prescriptions, the money transfers, the pattern with the other victims. You don't have to put yourself in danger. But a confession makes it airtight, Kirsty said, repeating what Marcus had told her. It takes away any reasonable doubt. It makes sure they can't walk. Marcus handed her a glass of water, his hand briefly touching hers. If anything feels wrong, if you feel threatened at all, just say the code phrase. We'll be inside in 30 seconds. The code phrase was, I need some air. 3 simple words that meant save me, get me out, I'm in danger. Kirsty had practiced saying them in the mirror that morning until they felt natural, until she could deliver them without her voice shaking. Now she stood on her mother's porch, the same porch where she'd played as a child, where her father had taught her to tie her shoes, and knocked on the door she'd once had a key to. The door her mother had changed the locks on 3 years ago without explanation. Her mother answered wearing the cream silk blouse from that night, her hair perfect, her smile warm and concerned and completely false. Kirsty, baby, I'm so glad you came. I've been so worried. She pulled Kirsty into a hug that felt like a trap, and Kirsty forced herself not to flinch, not to pull away, to play the role of confused daughter seeking comfort. I'm sorry I ran, Mom, Kirsty said, the lies tasting like poison on her tongue. I heard things that didn't make sense, and I got scared. Of course you did, sweetheart. Come in. Vern is here. We want to talk to you, help you understand. Her mother's hand was firm on Kirsty's arm, guiding her inside, and Kirsty thought of all the other hands that had guided her through this house. Her father's gentle touch, his protective presence, now 5 years gone. The dining room table was set for 3. Crystal wine glasses catching lamplight. Expensive china that Kirsty had never seen before. Candles burning like this was a celebration instead of a confession. Vern Coleman stood when she entered, tall and distinguished in a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Kirsty's monthly rent. His smile practiced and predatory. Kirsty, he said warmly, like they were old friends. Your mother's told me you've been upset. I understand. Losing a father is difficult, and sometimes grief makes us see things that aren't really there. There it was, the gaslighting beginning already, the narrative they'd constructed about the unstable daughter who couldn't accept her father's natural death. Kirsty sat down at the table, accepted the wine her mother poured, and felt the wire press against her skin like a talisman. I don't want to see things that aren't there, Kirsty said carefully. I want to understand what really happened. I want to understand why Dad died. Her mother and Vern exchanged a look, quick, calculating, conspiratorial. Her mother reached across the table to take Kirsty's hand, her grip tight enough to hurt. Then let us tell you the truth, baby. her mother said, her voice dropping to something intimate and terrible. Let us tell you what really happened that night and why it had to be done. In the van 2 blocks away, Marcus and Agent Reyes leaned closer to their monitors as Vern Coleman began to speak, his confession unwinding like a thread that would hang them both. Chapter 8. The Confession. The wine was expensive, probably older than Kirsty herself, and her mother poured it like they were celebrating something. Vern swirled his glass, watching the red liquid catch the candlelight, and began to speak with the casual confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences in his life. Your father was a brilliant accountant, Kirsty. Too brilliant, really. He saw patterns where other people just saw numbers. Vern took a sip, savoring it. When he started asking questions about my offshore accounts, about the shell companies, I knew he had to be stopped. But killing him outright, that would have raised suspicions. So I waited, watched, and then I realized the solution was sitting right beside him every night. Kirsty's mother squeezed her hand, mistaking her daughter's trembling for emotion rather than rage. I met Vern at a charity gala 26 years ago, baby. Your father brought me. He was so proud to show off his young wife. But Vern and we connected immediately. We understood each other in ways your father never understood me. He was a good man, her mother continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality that made Kirsty's stomach turn. But he was boring, Kirsty. Predictable. He wanted a simple life, work, home, family dinners. He didn't understand ambition, didn't understand passion. When Vern offered me a way out, I took it. The first payment was $50,000, Vern said, like he was discussing a business transaction, just to keep her comfortable, to keep her patient. We knew eventually Gerald would stumble onto something that would require more permanent action. And when he did, Vern smiled, cold and satisfied. Your mother was magnificent. Kirsty forced herself to ask, though she already knew the answer. What did you do? Her mother leaned closer, her eyes bright with something that might have been pride. Dr. Kettering was Vern's friend from medical school. He prescribed the medications, beta blockers, digoxin, just small doses at first. I crushed them into Gerald's coffee every morning. Told him they were supplements for his heart health. Ironic, really. He trusted me completely. She laughed, soft and terrible. It took 6 months. 6 months of watching him get weaker, his hands shaking, his heart struggling. The night he died, I gave him the final dose and held his hand while he slipped away. He thought I was comforting him. And then you were free, Vern said, raising his glass in a mock toast. Free to be together. Free to access Gerald's assets. Free to live the life you deserve. Kirsty pulled her hand away from her mother's, no longer able to maintain the pretense. You murdered him. You murdered my father for money and what? Love? This isn't love. This is survival, baby. Her mother interrupted, her voice hardening. Your father was going to ruin everything. He was going to report Vern to the FBI, destroy everything we'd built. We didn't have a choice. You always have a choice, Kirsty said, standing up from the table. Her chair scraped against hardwood, too loud in the sudden silence. You chose to kill him. You chose money over family. You chose. We chose to win, Vern said, standing as well, his expression shifting from friendly to threatening. And we're still choosing that, Kirsty. You understand what you've heard here tonight can never leave this room? Your mother invited you here so we could make you understand. You need to stop this investigation. Stop talking to that journalist. Stop digging into things that are none of your business." "Or what?" Kirsty asked, though fear crawled up her spine. "Or you'll join your father," her mother said simply, all pretense of maternal love stripped away. "We've done it before, baby. We can do it again. And this time, nobody will question the grieving widow who lost her daughter to the same tragic heart condition that took her husband." Kirsty's hand went to her chest, to where the wire pressed against her skin, and said the only thing she could think of, "I need some air." The front door exploded inward before she'd finished the sentence. Federal agents in tactical gear flooded the dining room, weapons drawn, voices shouting commands that blurred together in Kirsty's ringing ears. Agent Reyes appeared at her side, pulling her away from the table, away from her mother's shocked face and Vern Coleman's rage, and Kirsty watched through tears as they forced both of them to their knees, reading them their rights while the candles still burned and the wine still gleamed in crystal glasses. Marcus burst through the door behind the agents, his eyes finding Kirsty immediately. "You did it," he said, pulling her into his arms while she shook. "You got them. It's over." But Kirsty couldn't stop staring at her mother, handcuffed and furious, who looked at her daughter with something that might have been betrayal or might have been hatred and said, "You ungrateful little bitch. After everything I sacrificed for you." "You sacrificed nothing," Kirsty said, her voice steady now, strong. "But you're going to pay for everything." Chapter 9. The truth shall set you free. The trial lasted 3 weeks, though it felt like 3 years to Kirsty. Every day she sat in the courtroom gallery, watching as prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by methodical piece. The wire recording played for the jury, her mother's voice filling the room. "I crushed them into Gerald's coffee every morning. He trusted me completely." Pharmacy records were entered into evidence, showing the systematic acquisition of medications that had no legitimate purpose. Bank statements revealed payments totaling over $300,000 flowing from Vern Coleman's accounts to her mother over 2 decades. Dr. Raymond Kettering testified for the prosecution after accepting a plea deal, his voice shaking as he described how Coleman had pressured him to prescribe medications he knew would be lethal in combination. Sarah Chun took the stand, followed by Elizabeth Morrison and the widow of the third victim, each woman describing the same pattern: the investigations, the threats, the payments, the convenient deaths that nobody questioned because Vernon Coleman was untouchable. Except he wasn't untouchable anymore. The defense tried to paint Kirsty as an unreliable narrator, a grief-stricken daughter who'd misunderstood innocent conversations and fabricated evidence to process her loss. But Marcus's investigative work was too thorough, the paper trail too extensive, the recording too damning. When Vern Coleman took the stand in his own defense, trying to charm the jury with his distinguished bearing and philanthropic work, the prosecutor played the recording again. "We've done it before, baby. We can do it again." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder. Conspiracy to commit murder. Guaide fraude. Obstruction of justice. Vern Coleman received life without parole. Kirsty's mother received 25 years, her face blank as the verdict was read. No trace of the woman who'd once tucked Kirsty into bed and kissed her forehead goodnight. The victim impact statement came 3 days later during sentencing. Kirsty stood at the podium in the same blue dress she'd worn the night she'd overheard the confession, her hands gripping the wood for balance, and looked directly at her mother for the first time since the arrest. "My father was a good man," Kirsty began, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. He worked 60-hour weeks to provide for his family. He taught me to balance a checkbook and ride a bike and ask questions when things didn't add up. He taught me that integrity mattered more than wealth, that truth mattered more than comfort. She paused, swallowing hard. You took him from me. Not just his life, but 5 years of believing he'd simply died. 5 years of guilt that I hadn't noticed he was sick. 5 years of grieving a natural death that was actually murder. You stole my father, and then you stole my grief. You stole my ability to trust, to believe in family, to think that love could be real and not just another transaction. Her mother stared at the defense table, refusing to meet her eyes. Vern Coleman watched with cold calculation, like he was already planning appeals, already believing his money and connections would eventually free him. But you didn't steal everything, Kirsty continued, her voice growing stronger. You didn't steal my father's legacy. You didn't steal his integrity or his courage or his belief that the truth matters. He taught me to follow the evidence, to ask uncomfortable questions, to fight for what's right even when it's hard. And that's exactly what I did. I followed the evidence. I asked the questions. And I brought you both to justice. She looked at the judge then, at the jury, at Marcus sitting in the front row with tears in his eyes. My father once told me that the best revenge is served with proper documentation. I think he'd be proud of the case we built. I think he'd be proud that his death wasn't in vain, that his work helped bring down a killer who'd been operating for decades. I think he'd be proud that his daughter didn't stay silent. The courtroom was absolutely quiet as Kirsty gathered her papers and walked back to her seat. Behind her, she heard her mother's voice, small and broken, "Kirsty, please." But Kirsty didn't turn around. There was nothing left to say. 2 weeks later, after the sentencing was final and the appeals had been filed and the media circus had finally moved on to other tragedies, Kirsty and Marcus drove to Laurel Hill Cemetery where her father was buried. November had turned to December, and the first snow of the season was falling soft and silent over the headstones. Gerald St. Peter's grave was simple, marked by gray granite that read, "Beloved Father, Honest Man, 1963 to 2021. Kirsty knelt in the snow and placed fresh flowers against the stone. Yellow roses, her father's favorite. "We did it, Dad," she whispered. "We got them both. Justice for you and for all the others. It's over now. You can rest." Marcus stood a respectful distance away, giving her privacy, but when she stood and reached for his hand, he was there. They walked back to the car through the falling snow. Kirsty's grief finally transformed into something that felt like peace. She would never get her father back, would never stop missing him, would carry the weight of her mother's betrayal for the rest of her life. But she'd fought for the truth, and she'd won. As they drove away from the cemetery, Kirsty caught a glimpse of her reflection in the side mirror. She looked different somehow, older, harder, but also more herself than she'd been in 5 years. No longer the compliant daughter who accepted comfortable lies. No longer the woman who looked away from uncomfortable truths. She was Gerald St. Peter's daughter, through and through, and she'd honored his memory the only way that mattered, by making sure that justice was served.